Hello, my name is Alex and in today's episode we're going to be talking about Lindisfarne. Welcome back. So in today's episode we're going to be talking about Lindisfarne, also known as Holy Island. Now, some of you will know on this channel that I started a Masters in Archaeology at Newcastle University. Now, because of this, before I started my course, I wanted to get some practical experience of digging because I don't have an undergraduate degree in archaeology. And when I didn't have an undergraduate degree, I booked in a number of digs, and one of them was on Lindisfarne, which is one of the most important sites here in the northeast of England. So in the picture behind me, you can see Lindisfarne Priory, the village, and then this is the dig site where Dig Ventures and Durham University have been digging over the past few years. So in this episode, I want to give a real rapid-fire introduction to Lindisfarne, and alongside this rapid-fire introduction, I'm going to be talking about the dig and what they're aiming to do. So let's get into a rapid-fire introduction of what is Lindisfarne. But just before we do, why don't you subscribe now? If anything I've said's caught your interest, I think you'll enjoy this channel and the content I produce here. Now, let's get right into it. So, Lindisfarne, what is it? Well, some of the earliest records of Lindisfarne, they actually have a different name for it, and that is the British or Brythonic Old Welsh language that was possibly what some people call a Celtic language of the British Isles. And Mercat basically means the healing island. And we know that people were basically interacting with this island since the last ice age. We also have a story of where one of the early kings of Bernicia, which was the northern part of the kingdom of Northumbria, and would eventually, this guy who's called King Ida, his dynasty would eventually become the kings of the whole of Northumbria, that northern Anglo-Saxon kingdom in the centre of the British Isles. But basically he was besieged on Mercat or Lindisfarne by a coalition of 4 British kings. Now, those British kings didn't get on with each other, so the one actually murdered another one of the kings, and that resulted in their coalition breaking. Ida was able to escape Lindisfarne, and then from there, his dynasty then went on to basically become this very powerful dynasty that would control all of Northumbria. Moving forwards in history, we come to Ida's great-great-great-grandson, who is Oswald. Now, Oswald, his dad, was killed by his uncle. There's nothing like a good family get-together in the Dark Ages, again, or the early Middle Ages, depending on how you call it. But basically, when you do have these get-togethers, it's probably that they're all going to kill each other, because it's kind of like the mafia, but with sharp swords instead of guns. That's the best way of understanding the early Middle Ages, generally, from a warfare perspective. So what happens is that Oswald's father, Aelfrith, is killed by his brother-in-law Edwin, who he's been trying to kill himself. When he's killed by Edwin in battle, Edwin becomes king of Northumbria. And when Edwin becomes king of Northumbria, he rules for quite a long time for a king in that period, until he is killed by another prince of the British Isles, a guy called Cadwallon. Cadwallon kills him, and so then Oswald, who has grown up in exile across on the island of Iona, comes back across to Northumbria, and he kills Cadwallon in battle at the Battle of Heavensfield near Hexham. So once he kills Cadwallon, he takes over his kingdom, and he is a Christian. And so he wants to bring monks from the island of Iona, which was the closest monastery to where he grew up, to actually establish a monastery on the east coast of Britain. Initially, they try and establish with monks from Iona at Bamborough a royal sort of palace, and alongside that a church, but it doesn't really work. And when it doesn't work, the monks go back to Iona and say there's no point. And so because of that, Aidan stands up and goes, well, maybe if you'd shown them the milk of the milk of human kindness rather than the meat of the gospel, maybe they would have converted. So the monks in Iona go, well, Aidan's got the right idea, we'll send him instead. So they send Aidan across, and Aidan goes across to Oswald and asks for Lindisfarne. He's granted Lindisfarne, and he sets up there, and it's brilliant because, like Iona, it's an island, at least twice a day, because it's tidal. So the tide comes in, Lindisfarne is cut off, the tide goes out, there is a causeway where you can walk across. So that's the setup that you've got for Lindisfarne. So he establishes his monastery here. Now, he wouldn't have been the first people. As I mentioned before, Ida was probably besieged on here, and there's probably been human habitation on the island going right the way back to the Ice Age, because we definitely know that they found evidence of hunter-gatherers using it as a place of sort of like a hunting base when they're going out to hunt in and around the area. So that's kind of what's going on Lindisfarne. Now Aidan establishes a church here, and he probably builds a wooden church, because we have later sources that say that after Aidan's death, the church is actually taken apart and then rebuilt as almost like a shrine to itself, and they build a stone church around it, and it's then later on, when the monks leave, taken with them. So that's actually seen as almost like a relic of Aidan's first missional journey. But while the archaeologists from both Durham University and alongside this dig ventures have been digging, they did find a building just down here on the Heuff that's actually been described, or could possibly be interpreted as a church, but it would be a slightly later church than Aidan's initial church. It's not Aidan's first church on the island. What Aidan does though is he establishes a monastery here, and it's very successful and it grows very rapidly. And what we start seeing is that the church on Lindisfarne starts expanding and expanding and expanding, and it's given more and more land grants, and it's given more and more control. And it becomes a very, very wealthy location within the British Isles, and a very, very powerful one as well. Whereas actually, in fact, when we see the great, well, first of all, when the Lindisfarne actually gets attacked by Vikings in 793 AD, this isn't actually the end for Lindisfarne. In fact, Lindisfarne gets rebuilt and re-established and continues going right the way on. So Lindisfarne is granted more and more land to establish itself as a strong and powerful location in the northeast of England. That land obviously comes with people living on it who are to work the land, and alongside this as well, prominent people within Anglo-Saxon Northumbria, when they are nearing death, will often want to be buried on Holy Island to be closer to the saints. So they will grant land to the monastery as well, and so the monastery becomes more and more powerful and has larger and larger estates. And even when it's raided in 793 by the Vikings, that's not the end for Lindisfarne. Lindisfarne is more than powerful enough to rebuild and continue. And even when the great heathen host attacks, and you have all of the wars between the Viking army and King Alfred and the other kingdoms and that sort of thing, we still see that there's a probability that Lindisfarne is incredibly powerful. So much so that we see the community of St. Cuthbert, who is often sort of put around Durham, being able to basically act like kings of Northumbria as well, when we see that there's almost like two kings in Northumbria now. There's the secular kings, and there's also the power of the bishop, which almost certainly has their own armies and control and things like that. And it's one that requires a lot of extra research to understand Northumbria in the 8th, 9th and 10th centuries, because we've got almost this two power bases. You've got the bishop of the community of St. Cuthbert, and we've got this king of Northumbria. So both of these together are hugely powerful individuals with huge amounts of land, soldiers and responsibility, and Northumbria is strong enough to resist against expansion by Scandinavians, but also still stays within power within the sort of the whole of the British Isles. So with Lindisfarne being this hugely important location, we now come to the dig. So we've actually had for the last 6 years a dig going on at Lindisfarne, and it's being led by Dig Ventures, a community archaeology company, and alongside this as well, Durham University, and Dr. David Petts, who's an associate professor of archaeology at Durham University. Now, David Petts is really interested in Christianity in the first millennium, so from Roman Christianity right the way through, obviously, to Anglo-Saxon Christianity. So Lindisfarne is an absolute godsend, if you forgive the pun, for him, and he absolutely loves working here and learning more about the island. So when Dig Ventures and David Petts are working here, they're actually learning a lot about the island. And one of the things that really surprised them is that we have a traditional story up here in the northeast of what happened. So when the great heathen host comes in, the community of St. Cuthbert takes St. Cuthbert's relics and they go on a journey where they basically wander around the region before ending up at Chester Street for 115 years. And so they would go from Lindisfarne across to Northumberland at Norham, then from Norham across to Dumfries and Galloway to a place called Whitthorne, and then from there into the Lake District, and then from the Lake District they would then go to Ripon, where the monks would turn them away, and then they would end up at Chester Street, where they would establish a cathedral there where St Cuthbert would stay, where another great Scandinavian army would arrive, and that great army would be the army of Sven Forkbeard and his son Knut, who would eventually become Knut the Great. And so because of that, they would then come back up to Lindisfarne for a year, and then they would come back down when the Earl of Northumbria at the time, a guy called Uhtred the Bold, granted them the location that would become Durham. So that's the traditional story we have, but the archaeology is showing something different, at least in this site down here. And it appears that rather than the site being abandoned, it seems the site is in continual use from basically when it is founded right the way through to basically the 11th century. And that's when you see it getting refounded by the monks from Durham Cathedral, who under the new Norman leadership then come to Lindisfarne Priory and establish the ruins that you can see today. So that's sort of a little bit of an interesting difference in the story. The other thing that's really important to point out is that the monastery would have actually been much larger than we actually realise. So right here is where the dig's going on, and there were a number of trenches, which I'll come to in a little bit, but it goes from here right the way up into the village. And when it goes up into the village, we can then compare it to other monasteries such as Iona, and we get a real sense of the size of how big these early medieval, or Dark Age if you use that term, monasteries actually were. The other thing to realise as well is where it was situated. So over here you can see I've put the original harbour, and you can actually see from this Google Maps right here, there's a difference between the land on this side and the land on this side. So this has actually been filled in since the 17th century, when works to make more of deep harbour were actually put in place. And so this filled in naturally over the centuries. But during the early medieval period, the harbour would have actually come right up to about here. So if the monastery buildings are here, you can actually see they're wanting to be as close as possible to the water, not only for trade, but maybe for movement of people, all of that sort of stuff as well. So you suddenly get a different perspective of how the monastery was functioning during this early medieval period going into the Middle Ages. And it's pretty amazing when you think of all of this sort of movement of people and the size of this monastery and how many people must have been in and around this area. We could probably put it at least over 1,000 people likely living and working in and around Lindisfarne at this time, possibly even more, just due to the fact that there would be the monks and then everyone supporting the monastery as well through producing food, through producing items, all of that sort of stuff. So it's really amazing to get a sense of what Lindisfarne was like and how this was one of the most important religious sites in Northumbria and also in Anglo-Saxon England during that period. So that kind of gives you sort of an idea there. And as they've been digging at Lindisfarne, they've discovered a great array of different finds, from obviously burials, which you'd expect at a monastery where people want to be buried close to this holy site, through to day-to-day items, through to amazing things such as a necklace of rosary beads made out of fish bones. You also find things like gaming counters, which have parallels within the Scandinavian world. So again, showing trade and connection when we generally think of the Scandinavian world and Lindisfarne only having interaction through violence. And you also see special types of burials as well, called focal burials, which I'll talk more about in the next episode. And you also find these namestones as well, which are like tombstones, but obviously with the name of the person carved into it. And the purpose of those is often thought to remind people who would be walking past there to say prayers for the individual who is actually being buried at that site. So again, there's lots of different things going on here at Lindisfarne, and we're just trying to get a clear picture of what's happening through digging through and putting together whatever can be understood at these various different sites.